Drachinifel is a history YouTuber specializing in naval history from the 16th century age of sail to 1950. He has 511,000 subscribers as of the date of writing this script, the 6th of September 2024, and has produced 1,250 videos since 2009. As a channel specializing in a specific history niche, Drachinifel is well positioned to produce deep, long-form analysis of topics related to his subject area, though he occasionally produces short-form content. Over the years that I've been watching Drachinifel's channel, I've been impressed by the integrity of his research, the depth of his analysis, and his ability to narrativize history in a manner which is both appealing and faithful to the historical sources he uses. I've also noticed that although Drachinifel often cites his sources in his videos in some form, he hasn't always listed them in his video descriptions. I was interested in knowing his reasons for this, and also interested in his research methodology, so I asked him for an interview and he graciously agreed. Does Drachinifel do good research? In my view, yes he does, and this interview confirms it. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate your offer to take time for this discussion. Could you please introduce yourself and your channel?
Hi, my name is, I go by Drachinifel online, mostly because it's just all nice and unified, and I run the naval history YouTube channel Drachinifel as well, along with a few other ancillary things, website and so forth. But pretty much most people who are going to know me by the YouTube channel.
It's a very niche subject that you've chosen, so I'm sure I'm not the only person who's interested in what led you to this subject choice for your channel.
I just really like naval and maritime history. So although the early part of my professional career was as an engineer, to be perfectly honest, I did my engineering degree partly because it was the first degree on my list of chosen priorities where you will get a job in this field after the subject
practicality,
like above 10%. Because I wanted to do history or maritime engineering or something like that. But all the courses were like 4 or 5% chance of getting a job in the field. Right. If you're going to spend money at uni, that seemed like a bad idea.
Yeah.
I've always liked naval history back from when I was age 4, when my grandmother took me down to Portsmouth, and you can imagine.
Right. Okay.
HMS Victory back when she had a full rig, and at the scale looks when you're 2.5 foot high.
Oh yeah,
instant
very impressive.
addiction. So that I wouldn't necessarily say as soon as I could switch career paths, but when I got the opportunity, I decided, well, I'm gonna do this instead.
Fantastic. Well, that's quite interesting because I have never had any naval experience in my personal life, but I do have naval experience in my family, although both in ways which kind of dissuaded me from entering the field. My father was, for a brief time, a member of the Royal Australian Navy. That was before they discovered he was a card-carrying member of the Australian Communist Party. So they, they told him, well, come on, fella, that's just not on. So, you're out. And he said, it's a fair cop. So he had to quietly leave. Didn't do anything remotely significant, of course, mainly doing stuff like, cleaning the ship, maintaining things in working order and ferrying documents from one end to the other, that kind of thing. And this was back in the 60s. So a lot of Red Scare going on, but no actual combat missions to do.
Yeah.
On the other hand, further back on my mother's side, my maternal grandfather was a gunnery officer in a submarine in the Second World War at age 19. And you can imagine from those circumstances that, yes, this was near the end of the war when they were scraping the bottom of the barrel for recruits. And so my grandfather found himself in a hideous tin can, alarmingly close to the bottom of the ocean at age 19. And he never talked about his naval experiences. In fact, he made a deliberate decision not to. He was quite traumatized by his time in the war and felt extremely responsible. I mean, it's kind of really bizarre, actually. Think about myself at 19. I was thinking, I thought, wow, what was I doing at 19? Well, I wasn't giving orders for ships to be torpedoed, that's for sure, or doing traumatizing evacuation drills from the bottom of a deep pool with very dodgy scuba equipment. Yeah, so he had obviously some rough times in the Navy, which just made him, once he left, once he could get out, he got out. And then after the war, and then after that, he just didn't want to speak about it anymore. He was very conflicted about his experiences. I mean, as a 19-year-old, going into a situation like that and being responsible for ordering torpedoes and knowing that hundreds of men are going to be in the water, and there's very little chance that even if you are as humane as possible, you're going to actually be able to do anything about rescuing any of them, even if you are going to be completely humane. So those are my historical naval experiences. If I go back to my great-grand uncle, then we end up in no man's land in the Somme with my great-grand uncle lying for 3 days in a shell hole in no man's land with shrapnel in his knee while he waited for his company to retake the position, which was equally traumatizing. So yeah, I have. Oh, and then of course my father's father was a British artilleryman in the occupying forces in Germany. My father was born in Germany himself. His mother was German. So yeah, I have actually, ironically, military service on pretty much on both sides of the family. And my generation was the first not to go into service, and that was very strongly as a result of my parents' decisions and their instruction. That's my only connection with the Navy from a military perspective. And yeah, it's always seemed quite, I've always had a touch of thalassophobia. So I've always found the open sea to be just wild. And you see these YouTube videos of things like oil tankers just being carelessly tossed up and down like toys. And you just think, wow, honestly, that looks terrifying.
The one that's always given me the chills, because knowing as much naval history as I do, combined with the engineering of it, which I'm doing engineering, weirdly enough, has given me a lot more appreciation of some elements of it. But there was an account from a 4.5-inch gunner on HMS Renown at the action off Lofoten against Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. And when they were heading that way, so before the battle was engaged, they had destroyers with them that got detached because the weather was too rough for them to keep up. But at one point, he stuck his head up out of the gun mount to see what was going on. And it was one of those scenes where if you commissioned artwork of it and you didn't have the oral history to prove it happened, people would accuse you of being overly dramatic. Because it was a stormy night, sort of lit by lightning, and he pops his head up, he looks to his left, and the ship, the Renown, is in a trough of a wave. And this is like the North Sea bordering on the Arctic. And he looks up and he can just see this wall of water going up past him, past the height of the mast. And at the top of the wave is a destroyer. And he's looking at the keel of a destroyer. And that keel is like 30, 40 feet above where he is. And he's like, oh, okay, I'm going back inside.
Wow. So moving on to question 2, can you please describe your research method and what quality control measures you take for your videos? I've noticed that on quite a few of your videos, you provide a list of sources, and of course, quite often you cite sources in your videos and sometimes put them on screen. Although some of your short form videos don't always have a list of sources. So I'm interested in the decisions that you make about source selection, source synthesis, what do you do when your sources conflict, and your quality control measures.
So a lot of my research depends on what I'm doing. So if I'm doing a short form 5-minute guide or something, then I don't feel that I have to do quite the same level of research as I would for a long form video. But my general rule is what I call the rule of threes. Have at least 3 sources, because then, kind of like they usually have at least 3 sensors on aircraft and spacecraft, because then if one disagrees, you've at least got 2. And if there's no agreement between all 3, then that's the prompt to start looking deeper. But so with things like 5-minute guides and so forth, the other thing is, of course, making sure you have good quality sources to start with, because if you have 3 trash sources, they'll tell you anything. So obviously what the viewers can't see, because this will be on audio, but what you can see is my starting point is my office library.
Very nice.
So that will usually be my starting point, and obviously that's mostly published works, but also I've got a number of copies of or actual originals of primary documents
Oh, right.
on
Okay.
various
Yep.
shelves. So that will be my starting point, and I'll go, okay, having carefully selected pretty much every book on here for being published by reputable publishing houses and reputable
Yes.
authors.
Yep.
If I'm doing a 5-minute guide, potted history of a ship, okay, that's relatively easy to do.
Right.
To three decent sources, like so, does free. If I was doing a British battleship, do Oscar Parks, Norman Friedman, and Burt all agree? If they all agree, the chances are this is probably accurate. And so I'm happy putting that data into a 5-minute guide. If it's the long form stuff,
Right.
then you have to go a bit deeper. And also, I mean, even to be honest, with some of the more obscure ships for 5-minute guides as well.
Yeah, right,
when
exactly.
You go,
yep.
Yeah, when you go deeper, that's when you start looking a lot more into primary sources. So,
Right.
And that, and also, yes, stuff that's not really been written about that much.
Right.
So at
I'm
that
just making
point,
notes as I go here
yeah,
because I want to comment on a couple of things you're saying, which I think this is really good because it gives viewers a really a good understanding of how you modify your practice according to your subject matter and according to the video length, which is great because then people can understand that you're applying the same level of rigor to all of your videos, but in a manner which is appropriate to the subject matter and the video length, which totally makes sense.
Yeah. So my first stop there will usually be if I want to look at something in a bit more depth, it'll be to get something that's very well footnoted, like a Friedman book or something. And then I'll first look at their bibliography. So what sources, primary sources, have they referenced?
Right.
And potentially what secondary sources have they referenced as well, in terms of people's accounts of things.
Right.
And that'll be a partial shortlist, but I'll also go on to NARA, the US National Archives site, and the Kew National Archives and the various other archives that we've got in the UK as applicable. I mean, that will usually cover most of it. Obviously, and sometimes I'll reach out to other researchers and historians that I know who, they'll have information for, say, the German archives or the Japanese archives because they speak the language.
Right.
So
right. Of course.
For me, the online stuff in the US National Archives, obviously I can access online. It's in English. I understand what it's on about. And if it's not been digitized, I do have some friends in the US who can occasionally go and grab stuff for me. Kew, I'm 30 minutes away from Kew, 45, 50 minutes away from Portsmouth, etc. Most of the UK archives are accessible. I can physically go there.
Wow, right.
But obviously, if I catch a 2-hour flight to the middle of Germany to go and visit the Bundesarchive, half of the staff there probably won't understand what I'm talking about, and I won't necessarily understand the filing system or the resources. So it's better at that point for me to talk to someone who's actually done that research themselves and understands German intricately. But then, so for example, if I take, for example, my video on Operation C, the Indian Ocean raid, well, 2 videos, I looked up on the British archives. Okay, what are the records for the Eastern Fleet? From 3 months before to 3 months after the Indian Ocean raid, because if you put Indian Ocean raid or Operation C, the period sources, the actual things that were recorded at that point, aren't going to call it that. That's a
of course
naming of it. So I just went, right, I want all the records for the Eastern Fleet for 6 months centered on the Indian Ocean raid, and requisitioned them from Kew, went up to Kew, and just basically digitized the whole lot, something like 5,500 pages of documentation, and then came back, sat down with all my PDFs and went, okay, this is just standard stuff. Okay, this is where it starts to get interesting, and going through it all. And some of it obviously is just verifying what's been written. And some of it is stuff that hasn't been written down for whatever reason. Whoever was writing, the secondary and tertiary sources was clearly didn't think this was relevant, or maybe they missed that page, or they didn't access that particular file. And so that's where you get little details. Like if you look at most of the secondary and tertiary stuff about Operation C, it'll tell you that yes, Somerville was on a potential collision course with Carrier Division 2, and then he changed course, and so that didn't happen. But what most of the published stuff won't tell you is that Somerville had his carriers with full strike packages spotted on the deck, ready to go until well into the night. So he was prepared, ready, and wanting to hit them. It wasn't a case of going, oh yeah, well, we're going to mostly head this way and hope no one finds us. He was actively looking for a fight. And that changes the narrative in quite a few, if compared to what is spoken about quite often. So there's that kind of stuff. And then sometimes you have to work back again, because obviously some primary sources will be people's accounts of what happened. And although I tend to take the position of, if someone has orally described what they've said, that's great for telling their perspective of what happened. But if you're going to then relate that or use that, you have to qualify it by telling people that this is what, this person was there, they saw what happened, this is what they said they saw.
Not necessarily
strictly
what happened,
happened or why it happened.
Because we have to remember they have a limited perspective as well.
Yes.
And especially when it comes to naval battles, which are taking place really over massive scale. It's, as you've demonstrated in a number of your videos, it can be extraordinarily difficult for those involved to even know what's actually going on, which is obviously why some people lose.
And then sometimes also you have to infer certain things, and that's just inevitable. So sometimes there'll be there'll be two camps, or maybe even three camps, where lots of eminent historians have all looked at the same thing and they've all interpreted it differently, and there's still debate about it. And
so there isn't a firm consensus yet.
Exactly. And at some point you have to sit there and go, okay, well, I'm going to take this side, that side, or my own side. But then you have to explain why.
Exactly. And that's what I really appreciate, the fact that you say, look, this is an issue in which you communicate to your audience that this is an issue on which the sources are in some disagreement, and then the primary sources are in some disagreement, and the secondary sources likewise differ on their interpretation of the primary sources, and you're going to go with one of these for these reasons. That level of transparency, I think that's really important. And I like that about your channel, showing you're working out, as it were.
And the thing is, sometimes you have to take a side, because sometimes you're looking at it and going, look, this actually seems very implausible to me. Because everyone approaches it differently.
I know you. I remember a few times where you've mentioned something like that. You said that this account says this, which does not actually seem possible, although from their vantage point it might have seemed that way, but we know it could not have been possible because of our documentation of where these vessels were at the time, which we can demonstrate throughout the sources.
And sometimes you just have to present both sides. So for example, in the duel between HMS Shannon and USS Chesapeake, there are two versions.
I was just listening to that one last week, actually.
So there are two versions of what happened that caused Captain Broke of the Shannon to be not mortally wounded, but very badly wounded. And one version is the British version, one version is the American version. They agree on very few things. And the majority of it is two completely different ways. I mean, they both agree it happened in the final stages of a last stand on Chesapeake's forecastle. And that's really about it. All the other circumstances are completely different. But there isn't really any way of, from now, at least as far as I know, because as far as I know, Captain Broke never wrote an account himself, which, to be fair, given he was clonked on the head by a fairly sharp and heavy object, he probably didn't remember. Which means you've got the two cruise versions of what happened. And at that point, you can't really make a judgment, and at least to my mind, you can't say, I think this one happened. Because what are you basing that on? Are you basing it on, well, I'm British, therefore I prefer the British version, or what? So at that point in that video, I had to say, look, there are two versions. The Americans said this happened. The British said this happened. The net result was Broke was injured. Moving on, and then people can take what they like from that. And as I said, sometimes you have to infer stuff. So when I was doing the video on why HMS Hood sunk, which I'm actually still turned that into a paper and I'm still
really
working
fantastic
paper because there's even more stuff I've discovered since then that adds to it. And every so often I think that paper's ready to go, and then I discover something new which I have to incorporate. But there's questions about, like, were the signalmen on HMS Hood still alive at the time that she blew up? And which may or may not have an influence on whether 2 Blue was flying. And the thing is, obviously they died in the sinking of Hood. There are only 3 survivors, so there's not really, you don't know exactly when they died. But what you do have is Ted Briggs on the bridge, and after the last salvo from Bismarck that landed, before the one that killed Hood, he mentions specifically in one of his accounts that then the signal that he orders are given and the flag deck responds, and his thought at the time was, oh, the signals guys are still alive, this is good.
Right.
But then at that point you then have to infer that they are still alive 3-4 minutes later, because nothing has happened between that point where you verified they're alive and the destruction of Hood. Nothing has happened that would kill them. Therefore, likely they are still there. So if they were given an order to hoist down 2 Blue, they would have done it. You can't 100% prove it, but you can 99% prove it, but it's not certain. And there's all sorts of similar inferences that sometimes you have to pull together from primary sources where something has happened further back in time, and then when you get to the next point, nothing, you can't point to anything that would have caused that to change.
So
but you also can't prove that it's still technically the case of that.
That's right. But you can advance with reasonable certainty on what the situation must at least still have been.
I think the stickiest ones are where you have multiple primary sources which conflict with each other, and also conflict with an overall analysis of what happened, in terms of just looking from an engineering perspective or synthesizing all the timelines together, because then at that point you have to disregard one or the other, because they can't both mutually be true. But then that's usually in fields where there's still an awful lot of debate and discussion, and the people who have picked one side or the other, perhaps in isolation, perhaps because it just fits their narrative, they can get very defensive about, or even aggressive about, oh, well, why are you ignoring this source? It's like, well, I'm not doing it willingly, but you have to pick one or the other at this point. And okay, yes, in isolation, it's just 2 opposing voices, but there's all this other circumstantial evidence that suggests that one or the other is more likely to be true. And sometimes, and this is the thing with all historians, your background does affect somewhat how you analyze things, because someone who's got more of a anthropological background, for lack of a better term, is going to be thinking, oh, well, this person's background is such and such, are they likely to have done this or this in this action?
I see.
Whereas me coming from an engineering background, I'm going to be going, well, does this make sense in the context of what's happening to the ship at the time? I'm not so much.
And if the radio is likely to be still operational, or
and one video which I haven't published, because oh boy, are people going to get angry about it, whatever I say, is was Bismarck scuttled or not? I've been working on that one.
I knew you were going to say the Bismarck. I knew you were going to say the Bismarck.
I've been working on that particular script for about 3 years. But it's there are multiple instances where you piece together the various survivors' accounts. And ultimately you come up with a conflict where essentially you have to declare that one of the major narratives about how Bismarck sank, in at least in my judgment, is actually false and probably made up 20 years after the fact.
Wow.
To kind of salve the ego and the reputation of the ship and the crew, which is a pretty hefty charge to make. But it, unfortunately,
it's a thing that happens.
It just doesn't add up when you look at everything else that was going on that ship.
Right. Yeah.
And when it comes to, just to wrap this bit up, as you mentioned, I do list sources in my video descriptions nowadays. Initially, I used to mention them in the dry docks. I'd be like, hello, everyone, welcome to the dry dock. These were the sources for this week's videos. And then people were saying, well, yeah, but what if we don't watch the dry docks? So then I started listing them in the video descriptions. But I take the approach with my videos of my videos are kind of a stepping stone into naval history. Because
the starting point.
yeah, even an hour's video is 12 to 15 pages of A4.
Oh, of
You know,
course, yeah. It's a lot of
which
writing.
yeah, it's a lot of writing for me. It sounds a lot when you're listening to it, but if you were then going to look at one or two of the published books that I've referenced in that, you'll notice like that book is hundreds of pages
Yeah,
long.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so I take the view of, look, 5-minute guide, see if you're interested. If you are, then the long form content.
Yes, yes.
And then from there you can work out what you're really interested in, look it up yourself. But as a result, what I tend to do, not all the time, but most of the time, is I will list what I call the accessible sources. So a book that you can go and buy, or perhaps an old book that's now freely available. So if I've said something and it's drawn from a book that someone could relatively easily go out and acquire and read, then I'll list that, because then they can go out and check what I said and make sure that what I was saying was true, and find more details and everything about it. But if it's things like Admiralty documentation that I've pulled out of queue, unless that's formed a colossal bulk of what I was looking at, like for the Operation C video, because there just isn't a huge amount that's published about that. Normally, the primary documentation, I don't normally list the video description, partly because it would just make the video description a very, very, very long list of obscure reference numbers. But also, to be perfectly honest, 99% of my audience is physically not really capable of going out to those places. If you're living in the if you're living in the middle of, I don't know, Utah, if I say, well, in the National Archives in Kew in London, there's this document which maybe have supplied one or two sentences in an hour-long video, I may as well write, "This was revealed to me in a divine vision." All the fact you're going to be able to actually verify that. So it's a bit of a pointless waste of text. If somebody really wants to drill down and say, well, in this video at this timestamp, you said exactly this, where did you get that from? And it's not in one of my videos, then sure, they can email me and I'll tell them, well, you need this particular document. And if I've got it digitized as opposed to, having physically read it and noted it or something, then I can send them the digital page or whatever. So I'm always happy to back that up.
Yes.
But there are limits to what you can put on, what's reasonable to put into a video.
And we also know that for all we make an effort to do this, most of our viewers aren't even reading everything in the video description anyway, still less our list of references. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this part of this discussion. I really want viewers of history YouTube channels to gain a better appreciation for the amount of research that does go into the more serious channels, because it's the one part of our process which is practically invisible to them, because we can put a lot of effort into our thumbnails and people will notice, and our video titles and people will notice, and little quality of life changes and improvements like timestamps or visuals, maybe some animation, audio, background music. All of those things people will notice immediately, and they have an immediate return on investment, right? Yeah, you can see if you improve your audio and your visuals, you will get more viewers, you will get more people sharing your content, you will get more people coming back. But time invested in research and synthesizing sources and sorting out disagreements between primary sources, that is so invisible to our audience, and to a large extent inaccessible in various ways, one of which you've mentioned, that it just does not translate into return on investment very easily at all. And I really like our audience to get a kind of behind the scenes look at just how much work is involved. I dare say with my own channel, at least 70% of my time on any video is research, and then probably another 20% on audio editing, which is always an absolute pain, because I have to record it and then I have to edit it, which takes at least 1.5 times the time it took to record. And then I have to do the video production, which I try and do as quickly as possible using a lot of macros and plugins that I have for After Effects, because that's the part that I'm really not the best at anyway. And my videos are basically slideshows with, voiceovers and on-screen citations. I don't try and do anything fancy. That's not what I market my channel on. I try and mark up mine on the rigor of the research. But yeah, it's very difficult to communicate that level of research to your audience. And partly as a result, it's the one aspect of the channel on which you can spend enormous amounts of effort and time and potentially money and not really get a return on investment. But I really appreciate the channels which are putting in that effort, because I think it's a great sign of integrity. And when viewers do get an understanding of that, I think they will appreciate more the effort that some channels put into their videos, particularly when they're dealing with controversial topics. I made a number of notes while you were speaking about topics I wanted to come back to, because a number of points you raised about your research method really resonated with me, because I have a similar kind of process, and I take similar kind of actions. You mentioned that you look for at least 3 sources which agree on a point. And I suppose that's particularly important for your subject, whereas you've discussed very often you have conflicting sources. And I guess in one way, for a lot of your content, since it's modern, you're burdened with an oversurfeit of sources. You have so much information as compared to somebody, for instance, who's maybe studying the medieval period or antiquity. So on the one hand, you have this massive wealth of sources which have a range of perspectives and which are indisputably politically motivated and personally motivated. And there are reasons for your sources to be motivated to distort either consciously or unconsciously. So you have to be aware of that. And yet, on the other hand, you also have access to large curated archives, which must be enormously helpful. Like those archives you mentioned, military archives, where somebody has already collected a lot of material and gone through a process of filtering and some process of verification, at least verifying the provenance of these sources. And that gives you a lot of primary source material to cross-reference. But then, of course, the time taken to do that, just the idea of going to an archive and collecting that material and digitizing it and then searching through it. That takes me back to my early research days, not when I was doing my YouTube video, but way, way before the YouTube era, in fact, when I was doing personal research. And I would, back in Australia, when I would collect microfilm reels. I would have microfilm reels sent to me from the National Library archives through interlibrary loan to my local library. And I would take them to my local library and put them in the microfilm reader printer and laboriously print out page after page after page of this material, and then have it spiral bound and take them back so I could do my research on it. Hundreds and hundreds of pages I printed over several months. So yeah, dealing with that archival material can be a great advantage, but yeah, at the end of the day, you have to sort through it yourself. And I also like the fact that you talked in detail about how you select your sources for your short and long form content and how you adjust your research depth accordingly while maintaining the same rigor of research. And I love the fact that you explained your approach to conflicting sources. And in your case, you have conflicting primary sources quite a lot of the time, as well as conflicting secondary sources, because sometimes the situation is just extremely difficult to figure out and sometimes virtually impossible, and you have to make a decision, or sometimes you think you just can't make a reasonable decision, and you make that clear in your videos, which I really appreciate. And one more point I wanted to mention was that you talked about, when you're analyzing sources for quality, you mentioned identifying the publisher as one method of source verification, or verifying the quality of a source, which I think was great, because I think a lot of viewers aren't aware of the way that once you're familiar with the field, or once you're familiar with academic practice, you're able to run through a mental checklist when you find a source. You're able to run through a mental checklist fairly quickly, checking on a few points, which you can see very, very easily indicate whether this is likely to be a lower or higher level source, or a more or less reliable source. Is it a trade publication or an academic publication? And you'll recognize, because of your academic background, you'll recognize publisher names, and you'll know that, something published by Penguin is different to something published by Eisenbrauns, right? Or Walter de Gruyter, or a source like that, a publisher like that. And then you'll also be looking to see if the text has, if the source you're looking at has a bibliography or an index, footnotes, and what level those footnotes are in, and other signs of academic rigor. I'm going to put on screen, I'll show it to you now, and I'll put it on screen at this point of our video, a little checklist of mine that I developed as a result of my own Discord members and sometimes subscribers asking me, oh, I'm looking at this source and I don't know if it's good or not. How do you check a source? So I received this question so often, I actually ended up making a video about how do I check a source? How do I know when a source is good enough to be used in one of my videos so I can rely on it? And out of that, I made this little checklist, which I have as an active PDF with checkable boxes and text box I can write in quickly. And I can quickly run a report on it if somebody asks me to check a source. So this is what I use. But this is actually just simply an electronic form of something I'm doing in my head anyway. And that's what I explained when I made that video about how do I check a source for accuracy. And as I mentioned previously, it's the kind of process which, after you've had some academic training and after you've been involved in research for a while, you can actually do fairly quickly by checking a few key points and then drilling down a little bit further if you think you really need to. And I think that helping our viewers understand how we can actually verify sources quite quickly and reliably is very useful. We have a heuristic method of, we kind of triangulate a few points like publisher, and then footnotes and bibliography and references, and then maybe number of citations in a citation index like Google Scholar or another citation index, and then any reviews, particularly academic reviews, or if it's only been reviewed in trade publications, this kind of thing. So we can take a few data points and very quickly from that synthesize an understanding of how reliable this source is likely to be. And the last point that you mentioned that I was particularly intrigued by, because again, it mirrors my own experience, was you mentioning scripts that you had written, which you later turned into academic papers. Could you give me a little bit more information about that? Because I've had the same experience and I'd like to know how it happened at your end.
Yeah, so I haven't published any of them yet. Because I'm still working on them. Because essentially what tends to happen with my scripts is I'll go through them at I go through several levels of revision. So the first level is like, okay, here's everything about this that I think might be interesting to the audience. I'm taking it all in. That usually ends up being a colossally massive script that takes 4 hours to record. And then you have to start going down. Is this relevant really to what's going on, or is this described better elsewhere? Can I summarize this in a way that doesn't take up a page and a half? And eventually you end up with something that's half an hour to an hour usually, and sometimes that just won't work. So that's where you get the multi-part videos, because I'm like, you can't tell the story in less than this, therefore I'm going to have to do it in several parts. But sometimes, like with particularly, as I said, with my video that I did on the destruction of HMS Hood, there's a lot of technical information and referencing in there, which if you are sitting there describing it all on a video, it is going to be incredibly confusing to most people. But in a paper, that's exactly the kind of detail you want, because that's the kind of intricate stuff that other researchers can verify and analyze. And so what I've then got done is, okay, right, well, that's the version that's going out on YouTube. Here's the slightly larger version, the kind of, if you like, the original. And now I'm going to compress this down, not quite as much. And the stuff that's more narrative, that tells the story, is getting trimmed a bit more than it would for the YouTube video. And the stuff that's more technical and verifiable is staying in. And then that presents a much more technical breakdown of not just what happened, but why it happened and why I'm saying it happened that way, which is more suitable for an academic paper. And I've got 3 or 4 scripts that I've eventually gone through that process.
Excellent.
But of course, the only disadvantage with that is, like I mentioned with the Hood video, is that every time I'm happy with one, I tend to look through it and go, okay, great. And then one of the things I definitely tried to develop back when I was working in engineering was what I call the wearing of the opposite hats.
Oh,
So
right. Okay. Yep.
what I would used to do is I'd write a report. Let's say, I don't know, if I was writing a report on should there be a new bus route in this area, I go, okay, well, as a engineer in Transport for London, this hat says, right, this is why we should have it.
Yep.
I'm now going to try and imagine that I am a resident in this area, put that hat on, and
Right.
go, why
Yep.
would I not want it?
Yep.
Okay, flip back. Now I know what the objections are going to be. How can I modify the report to address
Right.
those objections
Yes.
before they
Yes.
happen? And similarly, with these, I may have become my own worst enemy because I kind of try and put on a critical reviewer hat and read it like if I didn't know any of this, I haven't maybe like maybe I'm a naval historian, but I haven't really looked into this particular part. If I'm reading this through, where are the kind of perceived leaps of logic? So it's like he said this, and this, but then he's gone on to say this, but how does this connect to this? Or, but what about this? Those kind of questions that will be asked. And then I'm like, okay, well, now I know what people are going to complain about. I'm going to put my author's hat back on again and go, okay, right, I need to fill in this gap, or I need to look for this information. And that leads obviously to another revision and further research. And then because you're incorporating new stuff, then that brings up other issues which you then want to follow down and develop. So that's basically what's happened with those. They're mostly in academic paper format, but I keep adding stuff to them. And so I've never quite been happy to send one out and say, okay, this should go out now. I think the Hood one is probably within 3 or 4 months of getting there. I would have submitted it at the beginning of this year, but then I discovered a whole tranche of information about the US Navy and its studies for the North Carolina class battleships, which are, almost a couple of decades removed from Hood's design, but also about 5 years before Hood was destroyed. But there's a whole raft of stuff of last minute design changes they made because they discovered the phenomena, which I explicitly attribute to the loss of Hood, and they had to take emergency corrective measures because they looked at it and went, that could potentially destroy the ship. We need to change the design, but we can't do as much change as we want to because it's limited by the Washington Naval Treaty and London Naval Treaty restrictions. And there's a whole thing going on with that. And I'm looking at it and going, okay, well, it's not specifically about Hood, but it is proving that somebody else independently discovered exactly the same problem.
Yeah, came to that conclusion.
Different ships, but for exactly the same reasons. And it was a big enough issue that they had to make design revisions. But of course, Hood at that point has been in service for almost 2 decades. You can't make that kind of design change, even assuming that anyone in the British Admiralty has realized it. And that's the other thing. Of course, this is the US in their internal design revisions. They've realized this. The Admiralty maybe has not realized this. And maybe that's why they don't do anything. But because that although it's an incident that happens in the mid-1930s, it's something that you then have to tie into everything back to the design of Hood through to her final fate and why corrective measures weren't taken in between, whilst simultaneously adding to the evidence that this is actually a thing that potentially happened. And so that's, off and on, that's taken me a whole load of revisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've had something similar happen to my own scripts when I think I've get things pretty much nailed down, and then I stumble across a source which takes me down another rabbit hole. And I thought, oh, why did I not think about this earlier? And then I have to sometimes restructure my script to take that into account. But one thing that you mentioned there, which I want to pick up on, which I really liked, was the fact that you try and approach an issue in your script or in your paper from multiple independent perspectives, different stakeholder perspectives, if you like. And I thought that was really great and a very useful way of writing the script and synthesizing the information. And when you use the metaphor of hats, I was particularly intrigued because it reminded me of a work by Edward de Bono, who was, I'm not sure if he was a logician, but he was a commenter on critical thinking, at least. He had some academic training. I'm not sure exactly. I can't remember exactly what. He was Dr. Edward de Bono, but don't know what he was a doctor of. But he wrote a number of works which were very popular in the 80s. And in 1985, he wrote a book called Six Thinking Hats. I remember it distinctly because we actually owned it. We owned a couple of his books. We owned one of his famous work on lateral thinking. And he describes in that book the process that you're actually talking about. So I was really fascinated by that, because I remember when that metaphor was, if not coined, but definitely popularized by De Bono. And I remember in the 80s, he was really big, especially in the late 80s, mid to late 80s. De Bono was really big in critical thinking. And unlike a lot of the works, especially the appalling self-help books of that era, a lot of his works actually stood up quite well and stood up to actual scholarly scrutiny. And I think that's a very good way to approach it as well. Not simply from the perspective of, well, would this person think and what would this different person think, but the synthesis. What would person A think? Okay, what would person B think? So how would person A respond to that, right? Talking about the interaction. I think it's that synthesis which really makes a researcher someone different to a mere collator. And that's the added value that people should come to a history YouTube channel for. Not someone who's simply repeating information that they found somewhere, which anybody else could read, especially, those channels which basically just read Wikipedia articles.
Yes.
But it's the synthesis, and not just that, but it's the independent synthesis. Not that nobody else has actually synthesized the sources in this way, but that you did it yourself and you had a way of working that out. And yeah, maybe you came to the same conclusion as other people. That doesn't matter. We're getting it through your eyes and it's being processed in your way. And we're seeing how you understand the sources. And I sympathize with your efforts to write those papers. I have actually had the fortune over the last 4 years to have a number of my scripts turned into academic publications, 3 of them as conference presentations, one of them as a scholarly journal paper. So this is actually partly because it was easier for me, because I do tend to write my scripts as academic essays. That's kind of how they start. Although I do modify them and narrativize them to some extent, I have to do that. And I write them in a voice which is designed to be accessible for somebody reading the script aloud rather than reading it in their head. And as you would know, as I've talked about with other YouTube channel owners, when you're writing something that you know you're going to be saying, you definitely have to make different word choices and you adopt different sentence structure to the way you would write if this is just going to be read in your head, because some things just sound fantastic in your head, but when you try and say them, you realize, after the 6th time, you then realize this is just not going to work. I'm going to have to split this sentence up, or I'm going to have to use words with shorter syllables, or those words just do not sound good together. It's very interesting, actually, when you start writing scripts for vocalization, that you really realize how people write and speak differently, and how, there are actually very good reasons for that, because some words are very easy to process mentally, but if you try and say them physically, it's just extremely awkward. You just almost literally can't get your tongue around this concatenation of syllabary.
Yeah, and sometimes it can even be something as simple as inflection, because if you write something in text, if you're trying to say ask a rhetorical question,
right, you
have to be extremely explicit. You almost have to put signposts saying this is a rhetorical question, not a statement of fact. Whereas if you're making a video recording, by your inflection and your tone, people can tell that you're asking them a rhetorical question or making a sort of a sarcastic air quotes statement about something. Whereas in text, it's all very dry and cut. And sometimes it can be very simple. It's like if you want to make a statement of fact, you just write it in text. Right?
Yes.
If you want to make a definitive statement of fact in a video, you actually have to emphasize, no, this, I'm not saying this is what could have happened. I'm saying this is what did happen.
Yes.
But then, as I say, at the same time, sometimes you end up having to make, you sometimes have to make things more obvious in text than you do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I end up using quite a lot more punctuation in my scripts, for voicing, simply because, as you say, without a visual cue, can be difficult to remember, this has to be said in this particular way. And you need a pause here to give people time to gather their thoughts before you hit them with the next thought, or you need a question mark here so people know this is a question or a rhetorical question, or you need to set this up so people can anticipate the rhetorical question. And in particular, because since I use YouTube very largely as in audio format, that is, I listen to YouTube rather than viewing it most of the time, because I typically consume YouTube on my commute. I'm really sensitive to channels which communicate all of their information effectively through the narration rather than things on screen. Rather, I know if I hit a video which is saying, now just have a look at this image on screen, and there's basically silence for the next 5 minutes. Yeah, what am I supposed to do? But that's something I like about your channel, because I feel like I can get all of the content very effectively just by listening to your videos without having to look at what's on screen. And sometimes when there is something on screen, you'll even tell me that it's on screen, which is great. And that's something I try and remember to do with my own videos. That's affected my own presentation. And even though I put my citations on screen and I put sometimes relevant images on screen, I do try and design the text in a way that people can always get the essential information without having to see anything on screen, so that anybody just listening to the video for whatever reason will find it just as accessible. I really appreciate all the effort you've put into answering that question, and I'm sure our viewers will really benefit from hearing that fine-grained analysis of your research. And like I said before, it's something that I really want to raise awareness of, particularly for those channels which I know are putting in the hard work. And I'd really like our viewers to appreciate how much these high-class channels, as I see them, are putting in that work, which is an important differentiating factor. Well, that's a great place to end this interview. And I'd like to thank you again for all the time you've so generously given me.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.